Good morning. Welcome with enormous open arms to the first ever Saturday of the first ever Yo Valley Organic Garden Festival. And how excited are we, frankly? Yeah. I hope that you're feeling really, really proud of yourselves, all of you, that when you saw this pop up on your devices and thought, that looks interesting, I bet if it's that Yo Valley lot doing it, it'll be cool and it'll be really well organised. Maybe we should buy a ticket right now. And now you're feeling really proud of yourselves because they're all sold out. So congratulations on all of you. I have a couple of really important things to say. The first being that this bit is technically the edge of the organic farm that we're in, the field. If you've not been here before, there are 6.5 acres of the most beautiful organic gardens that way, between us and the lake, near the big house. And the rest of the festival is folded beautifully, like little jewels. So you'll round a bend, you'll see a gorgeous bit of garden, and then there's another bit of festival. So there is another, if you haven't got your map out yet, which is understandable, you've just landed, there is another tent with very good views of the lake on the far side of the house, and lots of things happening in it. There's a yurt with lots of things happening into it. And then as you round another bend, there's the most beautiful silver birch grove with incredible music. If you all just had a bit and you need a bit of calm, you can sit in there. There's bee demonstrations, there's a compost station. If you bought your soil because you're testing sample because you read the email, there is soil testing, which Francis didn't know about. I was a bit disappointed, frankly, in the greenhouse near the cafe. So keep looking, look at your map. And the biggest dilemma you will have is, how am I going to fit all of this in and eat enough cake? But luckily, there's a lot of cake, there's a lot of coffee, there's a lot of good food. So you've got time to sit down, plot, and get round it all. We've got lots of people to thank, not least Sarah and Tim Mead, whose organic enterprise this is, and who came up with the thought of having an organic garden festival. And then the most incredible team who've put it all together, as a first outing. It is superlative. And also to Rocket Grow, who are actually sponsoring this particular tent, and they're just out there. They are neighbours, they're Somerset peat-free compost boys, and they're right here to chat to. The reason that I'm talking about Yo Valley as something else is because in my day job, I make television programmes, and I've made lots of gardening, and I'm lucky enough to be working alongside this gorgeous woman on Gardener's World, and have done for the last couple of years. So I'm going to hand over to her, and for all of those of you thinking, she seems really nice on the telly, I wonder if she's actually that nice in real life. I can safely say that you are in the most capable hands, and actually she's even nicer to my... So we're going to hand over to Frances. She's going to do kind of 25 minutes on the subject of there's no right and wrong. We're going to have a bit of a natter, and I'm going to throw her some astroturfy curved balls, and then we're going to open it out. So there'll be roving mics. And for people, keep your questions short so we cover lots of topics. But there's free seeds, so you get a mic and some free seeds. What more could you ask? Okay, I'm going to hand straight over. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. She has to say I'm nice. Anyway, thank you all for having me, and it's really a pleasure to be here at the first ever Yo Valley Organic Garden Festival and have a full tent of people. I presume it's raining outside, that's why you've all run in here. So this is a very big subject. There is no right and wrong in gardening. So I decided to approach it by just telling you about my ethos in gardening and how probably many people will think it's wrong. And then we can have some questions and discussion at the end, as Kath said, where people can throw in some of their ideas, or if you have questions about like a sort of maybe a contentious topic and you want to know whether you should morally do something or not, and I'll say, there is no right and wrong, do what you like, then do please think of things to say at the end, because it's really nice to sort of get that input, and especially in a subject like this. So, this is actually my current garden. This is a little scabious meadow that I planted this year. And you probably can't read those words because I can't either. But basically, what I was sort of starting with is the premise is there is no right and wrong. And I'm using that as a subjective, moral, maybe, framework for gardening. But there are things that are kind of the correct way and the incorrect way, or the traditional way and maybe a different way. And again, I think that's the thing I'd like to bust open, because actually correct, incorrect can feel like shackles a little bit. And when you're learning horticulture especially, can feel really overwhelming. And that's certainly something I've had. So my past is growing up on the Kent coast. I did my dissertation on Dungeness, which is what this picture is of, a little bit of kind of coastal flora and old junk, which is basically, without my realising it, permeated into my being and come out every time I've ever built a garden anywhere. And that's kind of the me part. And then I went on to be a gardener, and I learned the traditional way in a traditional setting in a very Victorian place where there was a hierarchy of the people who owned the house, then the head gardener, and then me as the apprentice at the bottom picking up dog poo, turning compost, making tea for the head gardener. And that sort of traditional education that came with that was incredibly useful, fantastically useful, and I still use it every day in my gardening life now, but also a lot of it, stuff I have completely shed. So most recently I was working as a head gardener, and we had 3 trainees come to us every year, and I would make them a cup of tea, because I feel like that's the kind of environment that I want to create for people. If we're nurturing plants, we're nurturing people as well. And so that tradition, that old-fashioned way, is something that I have kind of shed as I've gone through. And that goes through planting as well as through people and interactions as a gardener. This is just another example of beautiful coastal plants and how and why I love them. And this is an example of probably the best place in the world, called Toby's Reclamation Centre in Devon. Does anyone know this place? If you haven't ever been, you should all go tomorrow, because this isn't on anymore, and they'll be completely overwhelmed and buy all those chimney stacks. It's just the most incredible, slightly expensive junk that you'll ever find, and has informed an awful lot. I mean, just even the landscape of that is, from a design perspective, just all those stacks of old chimneys and bricks, and I just love it. And you know, we're talking here about right and wrong, and I think sustainability has to come into that. And so reusing, reclaiming wherever we can, not impacting, not buying things new, not buying things that are plastic, is really helpful. But I won't say that the other alternative of buying new things is wrong. It's just not how I've chosen to kind of conduct my own gardening passions, really. So, eventual harmony. So TV garden makeovers may not seem like harmony, but I worked with a wonderful team, including Alan Titchmarsh, who I know Kath has worked with a lot in her TV career as well. And he is another person who seems lovely on TV, but he really is lovely when you meet him. And he taught me this right and wrong in more of the traditional. When I first sort of thought of this topic, this is what came into my mind. We were building gardens for other people, and they often had their very specific needs, whether it was wheelchair or pushchair use, whether they were overcoming a trauma of some kind, or whether they just wanted a place to escape because they were doing amazing work in their normal life and just the garden was something to come back to. We built them a garden that they liked. And so it's something that I've almost been trying to shed in my professional life ever since. These were not gardens I designed how I want them. And whenever I've done garden design work, I think people expect something that looks like this. And actually, apart from that one in the bottom left-hand corner there, which you can see the teak decking and beautiful tropical planting, which I loved, a lot of these gardens were not things I would have chosen to do myself. That doesn't make them wrong. In fact, it really illustrates the point of how there is no right and wrong, because you're creating something for somebody else and what they need and what they love. And that variety is what makes life so interesting, really. So TV makeovers taught me an awful lot of that. And I think over the series of Love Your Garden, we did about 120 gardens. So there was a lot of opportunity to learn that lesson. For me, wildlife and wildness is a big part of gardening. And again, that's something I have shed my traditional learning in order to embrace. So where I remember when I first learned about weeds. Has anybody here done like an RHS level 2 or something like that? And you get a list of 10 weeds. Have you ever seen this weed identification list? Most of which are annual weeds, incredibly easy to dig up, and often edible, medicinal, wild native plants, which are fantastic. So things like chickweed. Chickweed is a substitute for lettuce. You can eat the leaves. It's something that we're all taught we should pull up whenever we see it. It's an annual, so if you've ever pulled it up from freshly dug ground around your allotment or something like that, it pulls out really, really easily. But it also is fantastic for your skin. If you soak it in oil for about 24 to 48 hours on top of a radiator, it will completely infuse, fresh, don't dry it, strain off the leaves, and then that is a fantastic cure for things like eczema. So for itchy, irritated skin, chickweed is a fantastic medicine. And I was taught to pull that up, along with other things like shepherd's purse. I was not taught about horsetail, which I do have to say is just the most evil plant in the whole world. But that wasn't on my 10 weeds. And I did, as you will see, learn to also semi-embrace horsetail. Japanese knotweed was not on there, giant hogweed was not on there, Himalayan balsam was not on there. So these are actual weeds that we do need to remove where we can, or get licensed people to do so. But what I'm saying is that traditional education, I have begun to shed and really embrace wildness and wildlife. So this is a really lovely bug hotel, which is actually photographed from a place called the Pines Garden down in Kent, which both my sisters weirdly work at. Not as gardeners, but it's a really nice little spot. And I think that kind of, again, you can see there's reclaimed material, there's embracing of wildlife. Aesthetically, I find it very pleasing. But then I might be wrong, who knows? You can see what I'm saying, it's all subjective. Right and wrong is really a premise that doesn't exist in the wild. This is my allotment, and if anyone is close enough or sharp-eyed enough, can you see the horsetail coming through? So this was an allotment that I had in Kent. People get very confused about where I live, and I get the same feeling sometimes. But I grew up in Kent. I studied up in Scotland at the Botanics, and then I moved straight down to the southwest. But when I turned 30, I kind of had to reassess and moved back in with my mum for a couple of years. Well, it was only meant to be for a short time, but then we had the pandemic. And I had an allotment there, and then I'm now back in Devon. So yeah, people get very confused. But when I was in Kent, I had this allotment, and it was on the marshes. So theoretically, a place that is very much part of who I am, on the coastal marshes. If the wind was coming in off the sea, it was windy, and if it wasn't, it was windy the other way. The only thing that consistently grew was horsetail, and no matter how much I dug it and added manure and compost and sowed seeds, I'd come back and the horsetail was the only thing growing up. So you can see how small these kales are. And that was the pandemic year, so I had a lot of time to really, water them well. It was a challenge, and I found it really actually a source of quite a lot of shame at the time. So I felt this was wrong in terms of the right and wrong premise. Actually, I'm going to go back because I think that it might be the only picture I have of the allotment. But what basically happened was I wrote a book at that time called The Modern Gardener, and a lovely photographer called Rachel Warren came and took pictures of that space. And then I got my job back in Devon because TV all but stopped basically for that year of 2020. So I got a job working in tree conservation on Dartmoor, moved back to Devon, finished writing my book, got some more pictures. And then when the book was put together, I realised it didn't look wild enough. And the only pictures that really summed up how wild that kind of aesthetic can be were the pictures of my allotment, which at the time I had thought was the ugliest couch grass, horsetail filled space. And yet that kind of meadowy softness just brought in an essence of something that I loved visually. And so I've learned to forgive it. And a very perceptive woman once said to me that, don't we all do that with pictures of ourselves? Someone takes a picture and goes, is that all right? And you go, oh, no, it's awful. And then 5 years later, you look at it and you go, God, I was hot. So there we go. There is no right and wrong, and you should always forgive yourself. So this is actually before I moved back to Devon. This is my little rented garden in Folkestone when I was back home for that 2-year period. And I'm not going to say it's wrong, because there is no right and wrong, but if you just look at the way that that astroturf has been laid on the floor, I would say that in my opinion, it's not beautiful. But as a rented space, actually, it was quite functional. And I wasn't intending to do anything with it. But then when we had no work and the pandemic hit, and I, like everybody else, got very into gardening, and I ended up completely transforming this space, which ended up being on the TV. So this was sort of the garden makeover program that we couldn't make, and we made it in our own gardens. This is a little shelving unit I filled with all my experimental tropicals like gingers and Vietnamese coriander and pelargoniums and lemongrass. There's a cardamom in there that got eventually destroyed by mealybugs, which makes me sad every time I look at that picture. But it begun to be that. So that's the same view at the beginning. That was the astroturf, and that was about 6 months later. And this was the kind of first space that I could experiment with that aesthetic about what I like and its texture, basically. So we did this filming in the garden. 3 episodes we were making. I was filming it all on my phone. We were very lucky that we had the team that would normally source all the garden makeover stuff were now working on this. So I was sent lots of plants and stuff to put in. The people that got the plants didn't necessarily understand my idea of pollinator friendly. So I got lots of very blousy flowers that had no accessible nectar, which for me, I can't really be bothered to grow plants like that because they're not really providing very much for other people than myself. So I planted all this stuff up. It was very pretty. It was very nice. Lots of edibles, lots of ornamentals all mixed in together. That's very much a part of what I love. And then after 3 episodes, we'd finished. I pulled out all the flowers and gave them to my neighbour Doreen, who had been hanging her head over the wall the whole time I was filming, wondering what I was doing probably. But she loved all the flowers and planted them in her garden. And then it turned out the programme had been so popular, they wanted another 3 episodes. And I'd entirely ruined the garden. So I think I stuck some calendula in just to kind of pretend all the flowers were still there. But it ended up being incredibly green. I basically, in that tiny space, removed all the flowers. So it wasn't hugely providing for pollinators, actually. It was more edibles. You can see things like fennel, there was artichoke, so there was some. But actually, it became this textural green space, which again, I would say was wrong. But actually, for this space, it worked incredibly well, and I was very, very pleased with it. That's another view looking back up. It was also tiny, really tiny, but a total respite. So this is the allotment. This is the messy allotment. Again, there's no right and wrong, and I spent a lot of that space growing flowers, not vegetables, which some people did have an issue with. I mean, there are different premises for right and wrong, and I did have a contract here that said that only a quarter of the space could be growing flowers. And then I argued that, in fact, without flowers, you don't get peas and you don't get squashes or courgettes. So actually, there are a lot more flowers than you'd think. And they sort of let me get away with it. But again, that's that summary of the kind of beauty that I found there that was not how I intended it. It just went a bit wild because that was its nature and I loved it. That's sheds. So again, this is more of a representation of how our gardens express ourselves. So the buildings and the things that we put into those spaces can really be an expression of ourselves. And for me, I remember when I did this, I painted it all white and I put nails in and hung all my tools up. And it was like the most excited I've probably ever been. because that's what I love. And it's like, actually, maybe with that disorder outside, you need somewhere just where there's a little bit of order and you know what you're looking for and you can actually find it. So then this is my new allotment. I moved to Devon. I had a new little plot. I'd been on a 7-year-long waiting list when I was first living in Devon. And by the time I came back, I was at the top and I managed to get this. It's a tiny, tiny space. And I started it, having not learned the lesson of how beautiful I found the wild bit. I started it with order and trying to create something traditionally beautiful. That's how it looks now. So you can see the order's gone completely out of the window, but I think it's about that embracing it. It's about that understanding that you can shift and move. And there might be times when order is exactly what I want, and then there are times when it's not. And that's all okay. Greenhouses. So this is actually, I will say, this was wrong. This greenhouse, this is my Kent allotment, and I've mentioned the wind from every direction. And I put it up wrong, but I'm going to blame my dad entirely for that because he got bored when I think we had a day and he got bored and couldn't be bothered to make it level. And that is wrong with a greenhouse. I'm just going to go and say that because every pane of glass had a tiny crack at one corner where it wasn't. And so whenever the wind came in, which it did every day, it smashed different panes. And the picture on the right-hand side there was Storm Doris? Do you remember Storm Doris? Or Dennis? I can't remember. Yeah, so that was the end of that greenhouse. But I have learned a bit. So this is my garden now. So I would say, although this is the latest iteration of my kind of working out what's right and wrong for me, it's not the end, obviously. I will probably have more gardens, I will probably have more spaces, and I will keep shifting and moving. But this is just the greenhouse that's the modern iteration of it. That is, again, more reclaimed, more junk. Reclaimed tiles from my friend Mel, from my mum on the floor. Not laid correctly, I have to say, traditionally, just laid on sand. But for me, that's not wrong. And actually yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I put a picture up on my Instagram of all the ferns that have germinated through the gaps in those tiles. And they look so nice that, yes, it's not the right way. You should probably put something a lot more solid that's going to suppress the weeds. But it's not wrong. It's lovely. This is the view of the greenhouse in the garden setting. And flowers. So I have gone very much through a grower mentality, also conservation work. And flowers was something that from my traditional background in horticulture, I'd almost dismissed, not as being wrong, but just as being something I wasn't particularly interested in. And I was wrong. Because actually now I've got a garden, not an allotment. I've filled it with flowers, which is the opposite of what I did in the little rented garden. So again, it just shows every space, every situation will bring a difference. This is more just an illustration of old junk and how it can be beautiful, in my opinion. And again, so this is my show garden I built at the NEC. And then that directly related into my garden at my house, and just recognizing that reclamation of things and how that aesthetic can go into the garden. It's not wrong, I would say, but you could just buy everything brand new and it might be easier. And that wouldn't be wrong. But when you reclaim everything, you're not making as much of a sort of environmental impact. So in one sense, that's right. But you might not like the look of it, and that's okay. Colour, texture. So basically, what I have learned about myself is everything goes. The texture, the green, the flowers, the form, the structures. And I think that's really what I'll kind of leave it there for Kath and I to talk about things. Sorry, it's a bit of a whistle stop, but I just think it's basically me exploring what I have thought was wrong and then rethinking that and then rethinking it again, and how that's all fine. And that we may think that what they're doing next door is wrong, but actually for them it might be right. And that if we're more inclusive in the way that we have these conversations, which is why I think it's very important that we then now have a bit of a discussion about people's thoughts, then it just makes for a nicer environment to go into gardening, because that right and wrong, correct, incorrect, I think is never very helpful for people when they're trying to learn something or trying to enjoy something. So I'll sit down again and we can we can chat. Thank you.
So I wonder whether part of what we're talking about is whether the words right and wrong are the wrong word.
I think you're right.
And that maybe there's a different way, rather than being quite so black and white. Do you think there's a different word that could be used?
I do. I mean, I suppose it depends what you can break right and wrong down. You can call it sustainable, unsustainable. You can call it wildlife friendly, not wildlife friendly, correct, incorrect, traditional, innovative, maybe would be the opposite of that. But I think if we kind of frame it in a way that we can probably all get on board with. I don't know, have you ever done this? I did a thing at work. So when I was head gardener, I was working in a retreat centre, a mindfulness meditation retreat centre, which is bizarre because you can't just yell across and go, "Oi, can you grab the broom?" Because there are like people meditating, or when you drive out onto the lawn to cut the grass and there's a circle, and you have to like really quietly drive back in again and wait. So it was very strange. But one of the things that we did as our staff training was non-violent communication. It sounds easy because you shouldn't have to punch someone when you're just having a normal chat. But no, it was actually really helpful and useful. And the basis of it was that you start from a point of agreement. So rather than going like, "You just did that and that makes you horrible," you go like, "Well, can we agree that when you said that thing, or can we agree that this conversation didn't go as well as we imagined it would? And we can both agree that, and then you can start to move forward from a point of agreement." So with this, I think we can probably all agree that something like considerate gardening is right, and maybe inconsiderate. So that it's not necessarily considerate to people, but it could be like, planting a running bamboo right by your neighbour's fence would be inconsiderate to them. But whether you plant something like a verbena or rudbeckia, that's considerate to the pollinators. I was sitting in my garden yesterday. I took this in my garden just the other day, and there were about 6 creatures just on a couple of flower heads of verbena, and 2 of those big garden spiders on a little South African rosemary plant that I had right next to it. And it's like, that's me being considerate to the wildlife, to leave that there, to not, cut it back until the spring. And you can be considerate to the environment. So I would say maybe right and wrong is not always helpful, but if we think of it as considerate and inconsiderate to whatever is important to you, that might be a more palatable way to frame that.
And also, from what you were saying about a small patch that was very green, and then the next garden you made had loads of flowers.
Yeah.
You're doing different types of sustainability. You're being considerate to different bits of the area.
Yeah, I think I was also expressing something in myself. I mean, the green was sort of a beachy garden, and it was in Folkestone, which is where my dad lives. So I know it well. It had this kind of coastal bright light, and it was south facing. And I think for me, I filled it with pebbles, and then I just needed to add green because that felt like something that counteracted that. But what I found about that space was it was really fun to play with texture. And colour green, because green is not one colour. I have a massive love of herbs, and in particular kind of medicinal herbs, because I'm not the best cook. Like thyme, rosemary, sage, tarragon, that's kind of like basil. Can't forget basil. But that's it for me in terms of culinary herbs. But medicinal and interesting functions, I think plants go along with people, and we've co-evolved with them, whether they're in another country or they're native to this country. Wherever our ancestors may be from, we have co-evolved with plants, and I find that fascinating how people use plants. But one thing that herbs have is a huge amount of texture generally. So it's like woolly thyme or Corsican mint, which have these really flat growth habits that kind of fall over the edges of things. And then I mentioned my South African rosemary. It looks a little bit like a rosemary, but it's a silver colour, and I think it's used to flavour Vicks. I don't think it's particularly medicinal, but it's got a smell. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's a bit of a challenge because it doesn't like the frost. So I have nurtured a few plants throughout my gardening life. But things like licorice, that's a beautiful plant with these amazing compound leaves. And I think in that garden, that was what I was doing, was kind of expressing the textures and how, like, playing with them, building my own confidence maybe as a gardener as to what looks good. And then having then built that confidence, you can then add colour, because that's a whole nother layer of thought. And maybe I was just getting to that stage of having the courage to start adding colour.
And the fact that there are those layers, and a lot of those, well, a lot of the green plants will be fabulous caterpillar food, won't they? I mean, there's all of that. You might not be a pollinator, but you might be feeding the precursor to that pollinator as well. So, I mean, I think within that, there are so many layers, aren't there, and so many types of garden. So if you are trying to grow Mediterranean in a bog,
Yeah.
that, whether we call it wrong, but it's going to be tricky.
But that also might be why I've got more flowers here, because I now live on Dartmoor, which is basically a bog. As you know, I'm very lucky. I thought it would be a lot wetter than it was. So I kind of went in it with a more idea of more resilient to water plants, which they do need to be, but actually the soil's very free draining, so I can grow more than I thought. But yeah, you're right. There is variety. And I think wildlife is probably a really interesting, and I would be really interested to hear people's thoughts on this, about right and wrong, because I'm talking about right and wrong methods of gardening, and styles, opinions. But when you come to right and wrong, there is another interpretation of that, and that's kind of a morality. I think we're in really dangerous territory applying morality to gardening. But when you talk about wildlife and when you talk about the environment, there is inherently a kind of morality that's on there. And I don't know how people think about that. I would really feel loath to say to somebody that it's wrong to buy in sandstone from India to make your paving. And yet there is clearly going to be a huge environmental impact on shipping that amount of heavy material across the world. Whereas if you went and you got, as I've done in my garden, I've got some old fire bricks from Toby's reclamation. They don't pay me, by the way. They're just really good at you. I just love it there. But yes, I got some old fire bricks and made my patio from that. And they've had another life before. They've been used before. I could fit them all in my van, but I have a very small garden. And so environmentally, that's much less of an impact. But I think that doesn't mean to say that I did it the right way and someone else did it the wrong way. I think I would never like to do that to gardening, which should be fun and enjoyable. And but yet there is inherently a sort of a morality with things like providing for wildlife, which as gardeners we have a fairly unique opportunity to do. But does that mean we should do it? Or does it just mean that we can do it if we want to?
And inspire other people while that's happening.
Well, yeah. Hopefully. I don't know if I do that.
I think we should probably, it's 25 to 12, so I think we should probably open the floor. And there will be a little range of microphones. There's a lady right here at the front. Where are the microphones? There's one here. Have we got one up this end? Oh, we have. Eileen, come on down. Literally. Ooh. People of a certain age, we got that, didn't we? Come on, Eileen. A lady in the blue and white stripy right here. Who had their hand up right here? Oh, sorry, it wasn't blue and white stripy. My apologies. Where are we, Sam? Keep talking, and Sam will catch. It's got.
If you shout it to me, I can then say it if people don't.
Keep talking.
Hi, Frances.
Yeah,
Hi.
there we go. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much. I really love your outlook on life. I think it's really generous and kind. But I'm really anti-chemicals and artificial fertilizers, and I would really feel that that's wrong. So that's just an interesting thought, really. Just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that this is the thing. It is really challenging when you think of right and wrong. And I suppose what we have to all do, not just in gardening, this translates, we have a very binary narrative, I think, especially globally, but also in this country. I think there are a lot of very sort of this idea of us and them, and I think what we can do is we can make our own judgment calls and go, I think that's wrong. I don't use chemicals either, and I choose that because I don't agree with it myself, and I choose not to do that, and I think it's wrong for me. But then we have to kind of find some level of acceptance in other people's differences and work to. I feel very passionately that we all kind of we need to work together to build something better, and you can't separate or think those people there are bad, they are wrong, because then they also think that you're wrong, for doing it your way. And I think we have to all find a sort of a common ground. Like I was saying about the non-violent communication, that common place of agreement in the middle. From then we can understand where the differences come in and begin to hopefully work together to make things collectively better, hopefully.
In one of the sessions earlier this week, there was, in the last couple of days, there was almost some sort of open confession. And an amazing woman put her hand up and said, I just feel I need to say right now that once upon a time I put AstroTurf under my son's trampoline, and everybody went, oh, in that sort of... I understand, because also the world is moving and changing very fast, isn't it? So what we did 10 years ago isn't necessarily what we do today.
There's definitely an evolution of ideas, isn't there? Always. And what we think is right now may not be right in a few years' time. And also, I think there's always an understanding of like a payoff. Gardening is a luxury, really. We're buying in plants always from somewhere. Where have they come from? Do they come in plastic pots? Do they come in peat-based compost? Do they come with artificial fertilizers? Have they come from the other side of the world? I heard a story about a nursery grower who found it was more affordable to start plants off in the UK, ship them out to Holland to be grown on, and then bring them back again. These stories of how even the plants that we grow, which seem so innocuous and beneficial, they have a kind of a footprint. And so, yes, there's an evolution of ever-shifting ideas and research, but there's also an understanding that even to do anything, there will be an impact somewhere. And so getting to understand like the spider's web of impact so that you can begin to minimize certain bits, like, eliminate the plastic pot. I think that's probably what, as an industry, we should all be working on. What could be a good, sustainable alternative? But you use coir as an alternative to plastic. That's made from coconuts. Coconuts do not grow in this country. They grow in tropical regions of the world. So that has an impact as well. So we're always, there's this recognition of a payoff. There's not one right thing. There's not one solution. There's always going to be complications.
More questions?
Hello. I've come in from the Big Smoke, London. I have a postage stamp garden, and I'm looking for which plant would you recommend for a pollinator?
Sure.
Within that? I only have pots. I have an espalier apple tree which struggles to get pollinated, so I'm looking for plants that I could probably put in pots that might pollinate.
Beside it.
Yeah, thanks.
There are quite a lot that you could use, but I'd probably look to something like rosemary, which has spring flowers as well. So you need something that's flowering at the same time as your apple to bring in pollinators. Doesn't necessarily mean that the same pollinators will do it, but that should hopefully... Rosemary is quite a general beneficial plant. Also, it's evergreen, so in a small space, you'll have that all year round texture. It's pretty happy in a pot. You'll need to keep it watered, especially as it grows bigger and it kind of shields itself from any rain getting in. But something along those lines, I would say. If you're using pots, you don't have to worry about your own soil, which is probably clay in London. Well, that's really cool because you can add grit to it, you can add manure to it if you want it to be a bit heavier. If you're putting something in that's quite a heavy feeder, you can get chicken manure in like a pellet, and it's a bit grim, but when I was in Edinburgh, we used to make balls of it, wet it and turn it into balls, and then put, for heavy feeding pots, put like 3 balls of chicken manure pellets at the bottom so that they can slowly be released over the growing season. But yeah, anything like a herb. Thyme is also probably really good. Oregano is an amazing native herb. So I would be looking for those sorts of things that are going to give you function to use it in a small space. I think that's really important. Beauty, preferably evergreen, and then with spring flowers.
Marvellous. More hands? Ah,
Hi there. I was going to say, I hadn't really, up until now, I'm learning how to garden and all that stuff, but the idea of putting a garden just in terms of making it friendly to nature,
Yeah.
it hadn't really kind of, until this talk.
Oh, really?
Yeah, thank you. And then I just want to say thank you for that, because in some ways I've just gone, oh, I like dahlias. And that's, yeah.
Well, that's okay. They're good for
I saw
earwigs.
that judgment in your eyes.
The garden I first trained in we had a collection of dark leaf dahlias, a national collection, and I'm still getting over that. Every autumn, having to dig them all up and keep them just from their tubers in the correct...
I apologise for bringing that trauma up. And then the other thing I'd like to say is, I know you probably travel quite a lot, but I'd also recommend Wells Reclamation Yard, which is phenomenal.
yeah,
Right.
nearby.
And that's,
It's Toby. It's
Yeah.
there are things there that...
Are there?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
Excellent.
So I recommend
there we
that
go, on the way. Is it open on a Saturday afternoon?
It is. It is. Your
so good.
suspension in the van.
There
that
we go.
have.
Yeah, it's
I've
so good.
tested.
Kath, we should make a TV programme about the reclamation yards of the UK.
Anybody else? Yes, please. Eileen, behind you, sweet. That's it.
I know peat-free soil is a thing now, but I really struggle with it. My plants in pots just do not thrive, even though I feed them with natural comfrey. I know, hasten to add. Have you got any tips?
Yeah, it is definitely a challenge, and there are different composts. You actually touched on it in the question when you said peat-free soil. So soil is the stuff in the ground, and compost is the stuff that we buy. And soil is actually a really good alternative to peat-based compost. The thing about peat is it's pretty much inert, so you can add whatever feed you need to it. It's very free-draining. It doesn't get too waterlogged. And that's why nurseries have used it forever. And the alternatives are still developing so that we don't yet quite have something that does all of those things. And I think the key is choosing different compost depending what plants you're growing. So if it's something that's quite kind of liking of a free-draining soil, I tend to go for something like the silver grow. If you are growing really heavy feeders, then you maybe want to go for something more like the Dalesford sheep's wool compost, which is much denser. But I definitely feel like soil is just a really, really good alternative. And I grow a lot of my cuttings now in soil, particularly things like molehills, which sounds bizarre, but it's all beautifully broken up. And you can I've been working with kind of pot-free propagation. So my natural way of growing veg, I grow a lot of veg, is in modules normally. And I got myself one of those soil, have you seen them? The plastic-free modules. And they're like a little kind of mould, and molehills work amazingly in that. So you mix it with something like a normal peat-free compost. To give it a little bit more density, you add quite a lot of water, and then you pat it all into these moulds, and then you dispense it out, and it makes like a little kind of sand castle with a divot in the middle that your seeds go in, and they germinate so quickly, and then the roots come to the edge and create a solid block. Soil blockers, they're called. And then you can plant them out just like a module. So that's really good, and soil's a great addition for them. In terms of, I think you're doing the right thing with a liquid feed. You could possibly get like a more specialist, you can get organic feeds if that's important to you, to add to your water instead of the comfrey, because that's a bit more hit and miss, or as well as the comfrey. But I would just keep doing what you're doing and watering them like once a week, really, with some of them that lose the nutrient very quickly, right from as soon as they start to germinate. That's what I have done and found good. And I mean, there are good. So down in Devon, where I have worked as a grower, there's one called Classman's, which people use a lot. It's a really good peat-free compost, but the company that make them are the biggest extractors of peat in Europe. And some of our trainees called it, it's like buying a veggie burger from McDonald's. So it's like, I've tried to avoid using that, but it is a really good peat-free compost that doesn't lose its nutrient quite so well. So just try all the different kinds, and with different plants, be aware that some will want a heavier compost and others will want a lighter compost, and just feed them regularly.
Marvellous. We've got time for one more question. Is there one lurking? There's a gentleman at the back. Thank you.
Right, you mentioned one thug, the, what do you call it, weed. But I'm interested because you've had one or two plots and so forth, how you've got on with the other thug, slugs.
Everyone called
The
last
reason
year
I
Slug
ask is that
Mageddon.
one night, or 3 nights following, picked up 200, and yes, a month later there were only 10, but I was just interested because you've had a number of plots.
Yeah, slugs are definitely a problem, but I never kill them. When I was an apprentice, I had to cut them in half with secateurs, and I did it for as long as I could, and then I thought, you know what, I never want to kill a slug again. Everything has a right to be on this planet with me, and who am I to say no to them? But what I have found is I have had a really interesting experiment this year with my Rudbeckias, which you can see, some of them have survived, but all the ones that have survived are right by the pond. And the others that were further away got nibbled down and never came back eventually. And my conclusion is that I know there's newts in my pond, probably not frogs because they don't tend to live side by side, but that there is something in the pond that's eating the slugs. It could be that the blackbirds are coming in to drink from the pond and then eating slugs on their way. Or I know there's also a hedgehog. So it might seem a bit abstract, but I think creating a layered ecosystem where you have all of those predators of slugs is really important. Voles as well they're quite good. So voles, they can cause problems to crops, but all those kinds of creatures will then help with the slugs. And it's a bit like the lady who swallowed the fly. You then have to swallow the spider to catch it. But if you have something like voles and you let them live, you might want to put in a big pole of some sort of bird of prey that will come and then keep the vole population under control. But it's a tapestry and it's a huge layering of ecosystem, as well as maybe going out, sounds like you've done at night, collecting up the slugs and putting them on a bird table for the birds to come and eat or something like that. So I think it's just working with it. The other thing that's really helpful if you grow vegetables particularly is let them get big and strong. If you plant out a really strong plug, then it will have a lot more ability to withstand a slug attack than something that's very small and weedy, which they'll come and eat. It's all those things. Regular checking underneath pots, things like that. But I've been very lucky and not had to intervene. But that I put down to luck rather than my ability as a gardener.
Yesterday morning, Alice Fowler was the first speaker, and she was talking about how many she's got a particular blackbird that's been coming in, and sort of she didn't use the word decimating, but there was that kind of sense of her red currants, and she was like, "Will you stop it? Will you just please stop eating my red currants?" And the blackbird took yet more, disappeared under the red currant and came out with a massive slug in its beak in a kind of, I think you'll find I'm doing this as well. At which point, amnesty was given. Right, it's 10:02. We're already 5 minutes over. That means you've got 5 minutes less time to go and explore all of the gorgeousness out there, and I'm sorry about that. I forgot to mention that there are gorgeous people selling plants and crafty, gorgeous artisan things. And on the other side, as you get into the garden, they've put some beautiful bays that look like compost bays, but instead of the bays, there are wheelbarrows. So if you buy, just on the wild outside chance that you might find a plant you like, when you buy your plants, you can borrow the wheelbarrows, use those to drop them back at your car, and then drop the wheelbarrows back. How clever is that? So just so you know, Frances is back in here at 12:15 for a panel, and she's in the bookshop at 2:00. Now, yesterday... that alone. Thank you, baby. Lovely.